Every mystery has a voice. Few dare to listen.
Softening the gas lamps into smears of dull gold and making the cobbles glisten like the hide of some patient, miserable beast. To the casual passer-by, it was merely another unremarkable November dusk. Chimney smoke drifting low, milk carts rattling homeward, a church bell tolling the half-hour with funereal good manners. But to anyone acquainted with the local gossip, that refined and most ancient of English blood sports, there lingered a faint and unwholesome expectancy in the air, like a room waiting for scandal to enter through the door. It was precisely at so idle a moment that Lord Peter Wimsey, dapper as ever in dove-grey tweed and leaning with an expression of quiet amusement upon an ebony walking-stick of faintly antique design, appeared at the corner nearest St. Agatha's Green. He was not, strictly speaking, expected by anyone, least of all himself. His train had been delayed near Winchester by a cow of ungovernably literary temperament, which had insisted upon contemplating the rails at length before consenting to be coaxed off them. Having escaped rail-bound captivity, Wimsey had elected to stroll the remaining half-mile to his intended lodging rather than suffer the indignity of a motor taxi with upholstery smelling of damp resignation. He paused upon the pavement and tilted his head, owl-like, at the somnolent row of ancient facades opposite, half-timbered relics that leaned conspiratorially forward as though eager to hear secrets whispered by the street. Somewhere behind those blind windows, if the letter from the Dowager Marchioness was to be believed, lay a matter of some delicacy, which, translated from the Dowager's particular argot, meant almost certainly scandal, impropriety, or death. Possibly all three. It was death as it happened, though when Wimsey first made the acquaintance of the scene, the corpse had already been tactfully removed, leaving only the tatters of rumour behind like cheap bunting after a fete. The bell of St. Agatha's tolled again, sonorous, lingering, faintly reproachful. "Curious thing about church bells," murmured Wimsey to nobody in particular. "They never hasten. One might be forgiven for imagining them Calvinists." He turned down a narrower lane and came face to face with a vicar's frantic housemaid who nearly collided with him in her haste. The girl gave a half-choked squeak, not of fear, but of thwarted propriety, before bobbing a clumsy curtsy. "Begging your pardon, sir, well, they're saying. I shouldn't be stopping. Only Mrs. Alderby's near faint with the fright of it." "Capital," said Wimsey warmly, as though she had announced a village fete and not a local terror. "Always invigorating when someone else faints first. It shows a commendable initiative. And what calamity has thus subdued domestic cheer this evening?" The girl cast a wide-eyed glance backward toward a shuttered house with an air of outraged privacy. "They've found Mrs. Venn, dead, locked away like she'd been hid deliberate." "Mrs. Venn," Wimsey repeated lightly, tasting the name as though it were an unfamiliar vintage. "Ah, the widow of Devil's Acre, unless I mistake. House with the ivy and the regrettable gargoyles?" The maid nodded miserably. Wimsey's tone turned reflective. "Curious things, widows. Society likes them tragic, but not too tragic. Devoted, but not inconveniently durable. Quiet, but never silent enough to be suspicious. And when they become too quiet, well, someone always notices." He lifted his hat a fraction, as though saluting some invisible usher who had just drawn back the curtain of Act 1. The mist thickened. Somewhere inside that shuttered house lay the first fracture in the agreeable surface of the parish, and though Wimsey could not yet see its shape, he recognized the faintest whiff of concealed design, the delicate draught of wrongdoing slipping slyly beneath a locked door. "A widow," he murmured, "is only alone when she has the luxury of innocence. When she hasn't, why, she is very crowded indeed." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey crossed the threshold of Devil's Acre. He found the gate unlatched, not flung open in the vulgar manner of panic, but left with that peculiar, absent-minded negligence which suggests someone meant to close it and thought better of doing so at the last instant. The garden beyond was oppressively tidy, the gravel raked to a severity bordering on moral commentary. Only the ivy, swollen and dark upon the stone, broke the orderliness, creeping upward like something with a patient appetite. A uniformed constable stood miserably on the doorstep, performing the particular variety of rural vigilance that consists chiefly of being in the way. At the sight of Wimsey's card, produced with a casual flourish like a conjurer's rabbit, the man brightened with grateful relief and ushered him through the door with the deference one reserves for cavalry arriving before the cavalry has been summoned. Inside was the faint smell of lavender water and cold ash, the sort of odor one associates with rooms shut too long against fresh air or with the particular brand of genteel unhappiness that dries rather than rots. A housemaid lingered in the hall, twisting the hem of her apron into a rope of nervous thread. "Upstairs, sir, if you please," murmured the constable. "Found her in the sitting room off her bedroom. Doctor come and gone. Superintendent's delayed. Rail trouble." "Cows again," said Wimsey absently. "No, sir. Horses this time." "Ah," he sighed. "The livestock of Hampshire is clearly conspiring against jurisprudence." He ascended the staircase with a leisurely tread, observing as he went a speckless banister polished to ecclesiastical severity, a vase of lilies bowed prematurely brown at the edges, a small side table bearing 2 teacups, each turned upside down upon its saucer, as though tea were a faith temporarily suspended pending divine clarification. Little things, all of them. But then, murder was rarely careless with its fingerprints. It preferred to leave them in code. The body itself was gone, but the room had retained its memory. A shawl abandoned across the arm of a chair, an untouched book left open and face down, spine protesting, and beside the hearth a toppled walking stick, female in proportion, of carved cherry wood with a silver ferrule. Wimsey paused, crouched, and righted it thoughtfully. "I don't care for this," he murmured, not in alarm but in interest, as one remarks upon a puzzle piece which has arrived ahead of its neighbors. The maid hovered in the doorway, breathing like a bird in a chimney. "Who found her?" Wimsey asked without turning. "I did, sir. Mrs. Alderby, that's next door. She told me she hadn't heard Mrs. Venn go out to chapel this morning, which she always does on Tuesdays, rain or shine, unless her rheumatism's up, sir, only it weren't. And she's dreadful punctual, is Mrs. Venn, sir, so I came to look in, just to see she weren't took poorly." "And you found her already dead?" A jerky nod. "Locked door?" "Not locked, only shut fast. I had to pry it some." And no one else in the house?" "No, sir. She lives alone. Only us comes by in the mornings." "Very solitary habits for someone who values punctual attendance at chapel," Wimsey remarked. "Religion is gregarious by nature. Salvation likes witnesses." The maid looked faintly bewildered, which was no doubt a mercy for her peace of mind. "And before you discovered her, did Mrs. Venn entertain callers yesterday?" Well, she fidgeted. "Yes?" His tone was mild as warm milk. "There was a gentleman yesterday afternoon. Didn't give no name." "Describe him." "Oh, I couldn't rightly. He kept his hat on." "Of course he did," said Wimsey dryly. "The guilty always possess an exaggerated concern for drafts." "Very well. And how long was he here?" Her brow furrowed, searching memory. "Not long. Half an hour, maybe. More nor less." "Half an hour," he repeated softly, filing the number away. "Did anyone see him arrive or depart?" She hesitated again, then shook her head. "I see." Wimsey cast his eye round the room once more, and something, not yet a clue, more the shadow of a clue, seemed to flicker at the edge of his notice. "And tell me," he said lightly, as though the matter were of the purest triviality, "had she many enemies, this widow whom nothing but a solemn church bell seems inclined to mourn?" "Oh, bless you, no, sir. Nobody disliked her. She was that quiet." "Yes," said Wimsey, rising slowly to his feet. The quiet ones are often the most fatally misunderstood. You may go for now. I should like a word with Mrs. Alderby next." The maid bobbed again and withdrew, leaving the door ajar behind her. Wimsey stood very still, his gaze fixed on the overturned book, the shawl, the untouched teacups, and, most curiously of all, the stick with its spotless ferrule. No trace of outdoor use. "A solitary widow," he murmured. "An unseen visitor, a punctual absence, and too much neatness by half. One can almost hear the silence rehearsing its excuses." He smiled faintly. "But silence," he added, "has never yet bested a good cross-examination." And with that, he rang for the next witness. Mrs. Alderby was produced with the air of a woman both gratified by calamity and outraged that Providence had not granted her a more glamorous form of it. She was of the sort that powdered her face as though embarking for a minor theatrical engagement and carried bereavement the way others carried lorgnettes, an accessory to be flourished at socially advantageous angles. She entered with an aggrieved little gasp, as though a death immediately 2 doors away burdened her with a moral distinction she had not actually applied for. "My dear Lord Peter, you cannot imagine the shock to our parish," she began before he had even seated her. "Perfectly dreadful. I've hardly breathed properly since breakfast. One tries not to dwell on such horrors, of course, though I believe it is one's duty to attempt a sensible reconstruction of events." "An admirable sentiment," said Wimsey pleasantly, gesturing her to a chair. "And how far has your reconstruction proceeded?" She leaned in with conspiratorial relish. "Robbery, without question." "Ah," said Wimsey. "Do go on." "Her brooch," she whispered, as though national secrets dripped from her tongue. "A garnet, quite valuable, sentimentally and otherwise. Worn every Sunday without fail. Yesterday morning it was on her collar, plain as day, and now gone." "Indeed?" His tone held a softness dangerously near amusement. "And you observed this personally?" Well, one keeps an eye on one's neighbors." "Educational, certainly," murmured Wimsey. She bristled, taking this as encouragement. "I happened to encounter her at the baker's, and she was wearing it then, and she never removed it except to place it in her jewel tray on the dressing stand." "How intimate a knowledge of her boudoir you possess," he said lightly. "Devoted Christian solidarity?" Mrs. Alderby coloured, missing the irony by a useful 6 inches. "She was frightfully reserved, you know. Some called her proud. Her curtains were nearly always drawn. Bad for the lilies. I told her so repeatedly. To keep the daylight out is most unnatural." Then, lowering her voice, "And people talk, Lord Peter, even when one discourages it." "But one doesn't discourage it," Wimsey observed. "One merely curates it." A tremor of irritation crossed her expression. "I only ever wished to help. She kept herself aloof. Not a soul knew her origins. She merely appeared one day, already widowed, already installed. No relations. Never spoke of her late husband except to say he had been a scholar of peculiar temperament, which I consider quite ominous." "Oh dear," murmured Wimsey. "A scholar, worse than murder." She ignored this. She had callers now and then, always men, scholarly as well, I think. Grim-looking sorts, terribly serious. Not one of them ever stayed more than a half-hour. Always a half-hour. Quite uncanny, and she never walked them out. They let themselves from the front door, as though she disliked seeing them go. "Ah," Wimsey's eyes brightened a shade. "Punctual scholars and solitary widows are combustible materials. Did any of these gentlemen ever introduce themselves?" "Never, nor speak to anyone else. Like ravens, the lot of them. One always fears dark correspondence." "Dark," repeated Wimsey mildly, "is a matter of perspective. Most letters are unreadable until one supplies illumination." She frowned faintly at this. "And yesterday," he went on, "you saw him arrive?" "No, but I heard the gate, and I saw him depart. Tallish, grey coat, hat pulled low, looked like someone trying not to be weathered by the world." "You did not," Wimsey said, watching her closely, "follow him to see which direction he took?" I am not the sort of woman who follows strangers. Only neighbors, he said, perfectly affable. A flash of annoyance betrayed her, then subsided behind genteel posture. He let the silence breathe for a moment, then said, "One last thing, Mrs. Alderby. You say you never saw her at chapel this morning. Yet if she was such a creature of punctual routine, her absence must have struck you before 10 o'clock. And when did you raise alarm?" "12:15, she replied. Too quickly. 2 hours, Wimsey murmured. A long time for concern when one prides oneself upon neighborly vigilance. She stiffened. Naturally, I hesitated. One cannot simply go prying into another woman's house. No, his tone was silk. And yet here we are. Her lips thinned. The moment hung, small, taut, and useful. "Thank you," said Wimsey at last, rising by a fraction, signaling dismissal without declaring it. "You have been most illuminating." She swept out, annoyed, important, and more rattled than she would have admitted under torture. When she had gone, Wimsey remained motionless for several seconds, gaze still fixed on the doorway. "A half hour," he murmured. "Always a half hour. There is such a thing as too symmetrical, my dear Mrs. Alderby. When life is tidy, someone is choreographing it." He reached into his pocket and produced a small notebook, turning a page with delicate precision. "Now then," he said to the empty room, "let us see whose watch is being wound here, hers or someone else's." And he began to write. He had scarcely finished the final jotting in his notebook when the floorboard in the passage gave a discreet protest, as though clearing its throat to announce the presence of someone attempting not to intrude. Wimsey looked up to find the constable hovering with a kind of apologetic stiffness. "Beg pardon, my lord. There's the gardener downstairs. Says he's been asked for, if you require him." "Capital," said Wimsey. "Every mystery is improved by earth under the fingernails. Show him up." The man who entered wore the stoic complexion of English soil, deeply lined, sun-scored, and allergic to unnecessary utterance. He held his cap in both hands with the air of someone resisting the temptation to bolt. Wimsey studied him a moment before speaking. "You tended the grounds here, I believe." "Aye. Daily?" "Most days." "Most?" Wimsey echoed. "I collect that most is an accommodating servant to a practiced conscience. Did you see Mrs. Venn yesterday?" "No, sir." A pause. "Not proper-like. Saw the blinds shut. Same as always when she had one of her callers." Wimsey's eyes flickered. "Ah, you observed the pattern." The gardener shifted his cap. "Can't help but notice patterns when you hoe the same ground 6 years. She were a woman liked privacy. Made you step round the side if she wanted some, it said. And did she ever look unwell, disturbed, frightened?" "No, sir. Only watchful." A faint shrug. "Like a hare what knows summits hunting it, but keeps its feet still." "Poetic of you," murmured Wimsey. The man blinked, uncertain whether to feel insulted. "And yesterday," Wimsey continued, "you heard the caller arrive?" "Didn't hear him go by the walk, no." A slow beat of stillness. Wimsey lifted his head slightly. "The walk. Singular. You imply there is more than one means of reaching the house." "Aye." The gardener seemed briefly wary of having said too much. "There's a back path through the laurels, near invisible unless you knows where to tread. She used it sometimes. Folk reckon the old vicarage folk built it for slippin' out when they didn't want the churchwarden knowin'." "Charming ecclesiastical tradition," said Wimsey. "And you think her visitor used it?" "I didn't say that." "No," said Wimsey pleasantly. "But you meant to." The gardener looked down at his hands. "I were turning the compost by the hedge. Never saw him come in nor go out. But I heard summit, branches shiftin', weight like. Not wind." "And at what time?" "Bit before 4, nearer to 4:30. Sun low, but not down. 4:30. Wimsey considered it a moment. "Later than chapel hour, earlier than sunset. A very comfortable time to visit a house where one is not meant to be remarked." He let the silence breathe. Thin, taut, precise. "One more question, Mr. Hemsley." "Of course. And Mr. Hemsley, this back path, does it emerge onto the road or into some more sheltered approach?" "Old riding gate. Gates rusted near shut, but a man with patience could squeeze through to the lane where the elms dip down, out of sight of the houses." Wimsey's expression underwent the slightest alteration, like a chess player recognizing at last which gambit the board has chosen for him. "Thank you," he said softly. "That is precisely the kind of geography murder prefers, the kind no one bothers to map." Hemsley nodded once, then made to leave, but Wimsey stopped him gently. "One last thing," he said. "In all the 6 years you have worked this garden, did you ever see her smile?" The gardener hesitated, and something in the question seemed to strike deeper than horticultural duty. "No, sir, never did. And that's summat I always thought peculiar. Woman alone don't mean woman joyless, but she looked like one what had learned not to show herself pleased. Like pleasure were a thing she owed somebody once, and weren't going to owe again." When he had gone, Wimsey remained very still, fingers resting lightly against the silver ferrule of the walking stick he had set upon the table. A house with blinds perpetually drawn. Callers all lasting precisely a half-hour. A woman who never smiled. A back path used by those who preferred to arrive uncounted. And now, a body, tidied away as though death itself had knocked politely first. He turned toward the cold hearth, his voice a thoughtful murmur. "Privacy," he said, "is the most expensive coin in the world. People pay for it with silence, with suspicion, and, on occasion, with blood." Somewhere outside, a rook cawed once, harsh and solitary, the sound of a witness with no language for what it had seen. And Wimsey, eyes faintly alight, knew at last that the half-hours were not habit, but schedule. And schedules, unlike grief, are rarely accidental. He descended once more to the hall, moving with the unhurried grace of a man untroubled by appearances, and paused before the stand of umbrellas near the door. They were arranged in a manner too pristine for daily use, like stage properties awaiting their cue. One bore a smear of dried earth upon the ferrule, recent enough to suggest yesterday's rain. Another, shorter, lacquered, wholly ornamental, was dustless, as though handled not long before. It did not, however, match the cherry wood cane upstairs. 2 walking sticks for a solitary widow, one used, one displayed. The constable coughed gently behind him. "Doctor left a note for the superintendent, my lord, if you'd care to see it." Wimsey took it without ceremony. The physician had the fussily upright handwriting of a man who believed punctuation morally improving. Cause of death: heart failure. No visible injury. Face somewhat contorted, possibly from fright or seizure. Estimated time of death between 3:15 and 4 o'clock. Wimsey folded the paper once, twice. "Between 3:15 and 4, he murmured. "And our mysterious scholar leaves, what was it, 4:30. He smiled faintly. "A visitor who overstays the corpse. Considerate fellow, one hates to cut short social calls." He returned to the staircase, not upstairs but half a flight, far enough that he could see into the small morning room whose door had been left ajar by some harried constable. It was a meagre space, narrow and windowed only by a slit of glass overlooking the laurels. On the escritoire lay several envelopes, blank, unstamped, each addressed in the same small, rigid hand. They bore no names, merely initials, 4 separate sets. He did not touch them. "Blackmail," he said aloud, without triumph. "Or confession. The difference is merely a matter of who seals the envelope." Behind him, the constable shifted uneasily. "Is it murder, then, my lord?" "Not yet," Wimsey replied. "At present it is only mathematics. A woman dies, a caller lingers, a back path rustles. A schedule remains unsmudged. There is nothing murderous in the pattern until one asks why the pattern existed at all. He went further into the room. The slit window was narrow and high, but through it one could just make out the darkest fringe of the laurels, a clot of green thick enough to swallow a man whole. "Tell me," Wimsey said suddenly, "was anything taken from this house besides the brooch so tenderly mourned by Mrs. Alderby?" The constable frowned. "Not that we know of, sir." "Then you might begin a quiet inventory," said Wimsey, "for I assure you something has gone missing. Blackmail rarely stops at sentimentality." He stepped closer to the escritoire and lowered his voice to a thoughtful murmur. "She never smiled," he said, echoing Hemsley, "not because she could not, but because the bill for smiling had not yet been paid." His eyes moved from the envelopes to the inkstand, then to the chair opposite. A second cup of tea there, stone cold, matching the ones upstairs. "A half-hour at a time," he breathed. "Gentlemen scholars, slipping through the side of the world, each waiting his turn." He straightened. "This wasn't a widow guarding a secret," he said. "This was a secret guarding a widow." And for the first time, the possibility of murder ripened, quietly, inevitably, as though it had been waiting all along for someone to speak its name. He did not at once return to the hall, but drifted instead along the narrow corridor that led toward the kitchen, a part of the house not yet disturbed by official curiosity. Death, for all its grandeur, rarely penetrates the scullery first. Servants hear of it long before they feel it. The kitchen door stood open, its hinges protesting faintly, and inside a pot of water sat cooling upon the range, untouched since morning. No breakfast had been taken, not even the pretense of appetite. He ran a fingertip lightly across the table. One place set. Knives aligned. No crumbs. A household where nothing happened accidentally. A soft scrape sounded behind him. The housemaid again, clutching her shawl about her as though the walls themselves had developed a draft. "Begging your pardon, sir. They're asking if you've done with the upstairs for now. Superintendent might arrive within the hour." "Delightful," said Wimsey. Never has bureaucracy been more elegantly late to its own performance. His gaze flicked to her without losing its languid ease. "Tell me, this gentleman visitor, when he arrived yesterday, did she seem pleased to see him?" The girl hesitated. "She never seemed pleased, sir." "No, quite. But did she seem afraid?" A longer pause. Then, I thought she looked braced, sir, not frightened like rabbits. Frightened like someone expecting a blow but intending not to flinch." Wimsey regarded her with a stillness more penetrating than any interrogation. "And when he left?" "Her hands were shaken after," the maid whispered. "I found her tea untouched. She was sitting like she'd gone hollow somewhere inside." "And you did not ask why?" Her throat worked. "It weren't my place?" He nodded, neither reproachful nor sympathetic. "No. Privacy is a terrible tyrant. It teaches obedience better than any master." He let her slip off again and remained alone in the hush of the kitchen. His eyes wandered to the side door. Narrow, paneled, innocuous. It opened onto a sliver of garden path scarcely wider than a wheelbarrow. From there, the laurels pressed in close, an alley of shrubbery that seemed purpose-built for secrecy. A half-hour. Always a half-hour. Because half an hour is long enough for negotiation, short enough for concealment, and too brief for conversation of an ordinary sort. He stepped outside. The air held that metallic tang of November evenings where coldness gives itself the airs of certainty. Fallen leaves thickened the edges of the path, and beneath them the faint trace of a footprint. Flattened, not muddied, as though the boot had passed before last night's dew. Not the gardener's tread, broader, finer-soled, and turning outward rather than digging. He crouched, studied it only long enough to commit the angle, then lifted his gaze toward the laurels. From here the house looked blind, sightless. Even in daylight one might drift here unseen, uncounted, unremarked. It was an architecture designed not to exclude the world, but to admit it secretly. He returned inside, closing the door without a sound, and made his way once more toward the front hall. Already he had begun assembling, not merely facts, but arrangement, a chessboard of habits, and one habit above all stood out: tidiness. The widow had lived in an existence curated to sterility, which is to say, curated for witnesses, not friends, not callers, not gossiping neighbors, witnesses. The constable intercepted him. "Shall I tell them you're stepping out, my lord, if superintendent asks?" "You may tell him I'm stepping in," Wimsey corrected lightly, "for I have not yet reached the beginning of this murder, let alone the end." The constable blinked. "The beginning, sir?" "Oh, yes. Death is never the beginning. It is merely the first thing dull minds notice." He collected his hat from the stand, hesitated for the smallest fraction, and turned it thoughtfully in his hands. "There is someone," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "who has been coming here not merely to hide their identity, but to sustain it. And yesterday, for the first time, the arrangement ceased to be tolerable. Not a meeting gone wrong." A pattern interrupted. He set the hat upon his head. "To understand a death," he said quietly, "one must first understand what kept its victim alive." Then he stepped out into the evening, bound not for the station nor the superintendent, but for the one place every liar dreads most: someone who has known them longer than they wish to be known. He walked without hurry, his stride deceptively casual, though his thoughts moved with the neat precision of clockwork. The village lay just beyond the bend where the hedgerow dipped, a scatter of roofs clinging to the lane as though uncertain whether to retreat into countryside or attempt civilization. Wimsey paused only once, at the stile by the old mill road, scanning the churchyard path that wound discreetly behind the vicarage. No carters, no idle watchers, no curious eyes from parlor windows. Good. Secrets bloom faster when unobserved. The vicar answered his knock with the faint, startled blink of a man who had not expected intrusion before tea. "Lord Peter." "My word, what an honor." "An accident of geography rather than theology," Wimsey replied pleasantly. "Might I trespass upon your good offices for a moment? Something in the line of pastoral recollection." The vicar ushered him inside with that half-diffident warmth peculiar to country clergy, men perpetually astonished to find the world intruding upon their mild dominion of hymnals and flower rotas. Wimsey accepted a seat by the hearth, though his gaze never lingered on the fire. "It concerns Mrs. Ashburn," he said. A soft intake of breath. "Yes, a most tragic business. I fear she was not a happy soul." "Unhappy in temperament," Wimsey prompted. "Or unhappy in circumstances?" The vicar folded his hands rather too carefully. The question had cornered him. "Temperament," he ventured at last, "or so she wished to convey. But I am not convinced unhappiness was her chief affliction. She struck me as a woman living in a state of perpetual expectation, as though always listening for something. Or someone," Wimsey murmured. The vicar's silence was more eloquent than a dozen affirmations. "You knew she received a caller last evening?" "I saw no one," the vicar said carefully, "but I have heard the rumors. I do not make a practice of trafficking in them." "Admirable. But rumor, when persistent enough, becomes data. Merely data without attribution." Wimsey studied him. "You performed her husband's funeral?" "Yes, a solemn affair. She scarcely wept." "Because she did not love him?" "Because she was holding her breath," the vicar replied unexpectedly. "That was the impression I had. An odd one, I grant you, but unmistakable. She behaved as though grief was something deferred, contingent on a permission not yet granted. She kept waiting as though the true reckoning lay elsewhere." Wimsey leaned back. And in all her years here, she made no close acquaintance, no friend, no companion. The vicar shook his head. She was courteous but impenetrable, a portrait face, if I may describe it so, composed for display, not for company. Yes, Wimsey said softly, a witness to her own life, observed rather than felt. The vicar glanced at him, uncertain. You think her death was no sudden act? I think suddenness is merely the part the living notice, Wimsey replied. The dead began dying long before they think to do so. For a moment, neither spoke. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Tell me, Wimsey said at last, was there anyone, before her marriage, who might have known her better than she wished to be known? The vicar hesitated only a heartbeat too long. Yes, he said quietly, but not from this village, from before it. Ah, murmured Wimsey, the geography of ghosts is always wider than the map. He rose, offering a light word of thanks, but his expression had sharpened into decision. He now possessed the missing hinge, an earlier life, a prior allegiance, a debt or danger predating her widowhood. Not merely a caller, but a continuation. As he stepped once more into the cooling dusk, he no longer walked toward uncertainty, but toward identity. The pattern had not broken last night. It had returned. He did not return directly to the hall. Instead, he took the narrower path that skirted the churchyard wall, the stones greened and leaning like elderly conspirators, bowing their heads in confidence. The wind moved through the yews with a drawn-out sigh, half lamentation, half warning. Wimsey paused only once, at the graves nearest the west end, where a pair of names worn to faint relief suggested a family long extinguished. The past, here, did not vanish. It accumulated. A life before this village, a bond strong enough to reappear after years in hiding. A summons that came not to comfort, but to close a chapter improperly ended. He had seen the look before. Not despair, but resignation. Resignation that arrives only when something has finally caught up. He reached the small lane by the smithy, just as a boy hurried past, carrying the evening post toward the hall. Wimsey hailed him lightly and received, without protest, the letters meant for delivery. Most were addressed to Sir Lionel's steward, routine and dull, but one envelope, of far thinner paper and bearing a London hand, lay sealed not with wax, but with a curious restraint, as though whoever posted it wished it to arrive unnoticed. He turned it over. No crest, no flourish, only a precise, unornamented script. The postmark, King's Cross, a strange origin for condolence. He slipped the letter into his pocket and continued toward the road that wound back to the estate. The dusk had thickened slightly, gathering into the folds of hedgerows and low stone walls like a second, quieter population listening from the dark. As he approached the hall's side entrance, he caught sight of movement by the orangery, swift, nervous, and too self-conscious to be innocent. Not a servant. Servants hurry toward their duties, not away from shadows. He altered his approach, neither hurrying nor pausing, merely shifting his route in a wide arc until he came up behind the grove at an indirect angle. The figure, now half visible, young, slight, with the rigid posture of someone who has either rehearsed a lie or listened too long at keyholes, was trying the latch of a side window with a persistence unbecoming a spontaneous impulse. Wimsey said gently, "If you mean to burgle the place, I feel bound to warn you that the orangery contains nothing of value except persimmons, and those chiefly of philosophical interest." The figure started violently and spun round. A girl, no older than 19, perhaps 20, her throat working with a swallow she could not quite manage. You oughtn't be here," she stammered, "and yet I persist." He gave a slight bow. "Lord Peter Wimsey, and you, I take it, are not merely out for a meditative constitutional." Her hands clenched at her sides. She looked not frightened so much as trapped. An animal that knows flight has already failed. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I only came to see—" "To see what?" Wimsey asked. "Or to see whether—" She bit her lip. The flinch, not of guilt, but of recognition, gave him his answer before she spoke. "You know who she was before," the girl said slowly, voice harsh with effort. "You must, or you wouldn't be asking the way you do." Wimsey regarded her with a gentleness entirely devoid of softness. "No," he replied, "not yet. But you do. And that is why you are here, at dusk, at windows, instead of daylight and doors." Something in her composure trembled, cracked, but did not yet fall. "I can't speak outside," she said in a strained whisper. "Not where anyone might hear." Wimsey inclined his head slightly toward the orangery doors. "Come inside," he said. "Some truths require a roof before they will stand up straight." The orangery was dim but warm, the last of the day's light pooling through the high glass panes in a greenish tint that made the air feel older than it was. She stood just inside the threshold, as though stepping further might constitute a confession. Wimsey did not press her. He merely took a leisurely interest in the potted lemon trees until the silence grew unbearable enough that she filled it. "I shouldn't even be speaking to you," she said at last. "If they knew—" He turned slightly. One rarely risks secrecy unless the alternative is worse. Her throat worked again and she moved another step inward. "I thought she'd gone abroad. Everyone said so, that she'd simply left, and I believed it until he bought this place and brought her back here." "Back," Wimsey repeated mildly, "is a geographical word one seldom uses without history attached. Pray continue." The girl looked up sharply, as if startled by his calmness. "You don't understand. She wasn't invited back. She was brought. I knew her before anyone here knew her name. She didn't belong to him. She belonged to someone else first, and he pretended none of it ever existed." "Did Sir Lionel pretend?" Wimsey said, "or insist?" She turned away, pacing a short and desperate line between the citrus tubs. "He erased her. That's what everyone kept saying, that she was a recluse, that she never came down to dinner, that her health was too delicate for visitors. But she wasn't delicate, not then. She was alive," he supplied softly. The girl shut her eyes as if struck. "Yes." Wimsey watched her a moment longer, then crossed to one of the wrought iron chairs and sat with the unhurried grace of a man content to wait out the truth. "And you came here this evening hoping to find something she left behind. A letter, perhaps. A sign she meant to be found." The girl said nothing, but her silence carried assent. "There is a question," he continued lightly, "which I must ask, and you may answer it or not as your conscience allows. When you say you knew her before, did you know her as Lady Chevenham, or by some other name?" She hesitated. There, just on the edge of admission, before breathing, "Not that name. Not then." A small and telling crack. She had belonged to another life, and that life had teeth. Wimsey tilted his head. "You came because she did not go abroad, because you think she never left this place at all?" The girl flinched, hard. "I know she didn't." "Because you saw her?" he asked, voice mild as silk thread. Her answer came in a whisper that sounded half like fear and half like loyalty forced past breaking point. "Because she wrote to me." Ah. Wimsey did not move a finger, but inwardly a hinge turned, a bolt drew back, and the puzzle admitted a new architecture. "Recently?" he asked. "Last month." "After the supposed illness," he murmured, "and before Sir Lionel's sudden mourning." The girl nodded, arms wrapped tight, as though anchoring herself to a world that had shifted underfoot. "She said she was afraid," she whispered, "that she had made a mistake coming back, that someone here meant to keep her quiet, and that if anything happened to her, someone must know who she really was. Wimsey regarded her steadily. And who was she really? The girl's voice trembled but held. Her name wasn't Chevenham, she said. It was Margaret Hale, and she wasn't a widow at all. For a heartbeat, the words settled between them without commentary, like ash after a sudden flame. Wimsey merely folded one leg over the other and regarded the girl as though she had announced nothing more consequential than a change in the barometer. Not a widow, he repeated softly, yet installed as one, dressed as one, and mourned as one. A most curious resurrection in reverse. Tell me, my dear child, if she was not bereaved, who precisely was supposed to be dead? The girl clasped her hands tightly together. That's just it. No one. Not at first. She disappeared. People assumed she'd run away, and for a while it suited everyone not to ask where. Convenient silences, said Wimsey, are seldom accidental. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and fearful. There was someone she was hiding from. Someone who wouldn't let her live her life. Someone who knew how to make a woman vanish without leaving so much as an argument behind. Not Sir Lionel? Wimsey asked. She shook her head at once. No, he came after. Much later. He was the opportunity, I suppose you'd call it. A new name, a new station. But I don't think he ever knew what she was running from, or if he did, he learned too late. Wimsey gave a faint hum, as though turning over a coin with two faces. And you are certain her letter came from this house? Yes. The address was postmarked from the village. She told me she wanted to meet me, properly, without fear this time. She said she was safe at last, that she might even go abroad for a while when she was strong enough, and then, not long after, she wrote again. Shorter, different, afraid. The girl swallowed. She said someone here had seen through her name, and that she might not have time to send another. A very gentle pause. Wimsey leaned back, steepling his fingers loosely. And upon hearing of her death, you did not believe it. I believed something had happened, just not the right thing. Not a peaceful illness. Not a woman fading quietly upstairs. She wouldn't have stayed hidden this long only to surrender meekly to a doctor and a closed door. A fair objection, said Wimsey. People fleeing their pasts rarely die with tidy obedience to housekeeping schedules. The girl almost laughed, but the sound caught in her chest and died there. We were friends, she said after a moment, almost pleadingly. You must understand that. She trusted me once. I thought if I came here before anyone got rid of her things, before they erased her again, I might find proof she didn't mean to disappear this time. And what do you imagine you would have done with such proof? Wimsey asked gently. She hesitated, just long enough for her intentions to appear far more serious than curiosity. I would have brought it to someone who couldn't be made to look away. And yet, Wimsey observed, rising slowly, you brought it to me instead, before ever finding it. The girl looked startled. Because she had not planned to? Because panic and hope had collided just long enough to drag her into confession before she realized she had crossed that line. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. Quite right, Wimsey said mildly. When one is standing at the edge of a secret, it is often safest to hand the lantern to someone else. He crossed to the door and looked out toward the long lawn where darkness had pooled like ink. There is one more small question, purely a matter of intellectual housekeeping. You are very sure she was not a widow, but are you equally sure that she was not? He turned his head slightly, gaze sharp as wire. A wife already? The girl's breath left her as though knocked loose. She did not answer. She did not need to. Her silence was not evasive. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting for the question, dreading its arrival, knowing that once spoken aloud, it could never again be stuffed back into the dark. Wimsey did not press her at once. He merely allowed the stillness to settle, like a curtain lowering between acts, until the shape of her fear stood plainly in the half-light. When a woman changes her name, he said at last, everyone assumes she is burying a past. They rarely consider she might be burying a present. That struck. The girl drew a shaking breath. "She was married," she whispered, the words seeming to cost her more than tears would have. "But not to Sir Lionel, not to anyone here. She married in London, quietly, under her real name. He was well connected, the sort of man no one ever calls cruel in print, only difficult, or ardent, or possessive, which is merely cruelty with stationery and a calling card." "And when she left him," Wimsey murmured, "he did not take the hint?" "He didn't take the loss," she said hoarsely. "He followed her. Not openly, he wouldn't risk scandal. Just pressure, letters sent to places she hadn't yet moved to, people repeating things they had no way of knowing, the sort of pursuit one can never prove enough to stop." "Ah," said Wimsey with painful softness, "the devoted hunter who prays for his quarry nightly that she may never fall into the hands of beasts." The girl's face crumpled, not into tears, but into that rigid, white-knuckled effort not to show them. "She tried to divorce him once," she said after a moment. "She even had grounds. But he threatened to ruin her parents. They weren't wealthy, and her father relied on a modest pension controlled by one of her husband's cousins. She chose disappearing over destroying them." "A noble variety of martyrdom," Wimsey replied, "customarily rewarded by a second crucifixion at a leisure." He paced a slow line toward the window, fingertips grazing the cool edge of a marble ledge. "Then Sir Lionel appears, eligible, solitary, and, I suppose, convenient. An alliance of protection rather than passion." The girl nodded faintly. "He gave her a new name, and for a while I think she almost believed she had escaped." "But not quite," Wimsey said. "One never escapes a man who believes himself wronged by the laws of nature rather than circumstance. He will not pursue a runaway wife, no. He will pursue a possession improperly reclaimed." The girl shivered. "That postmark," she whispered. "You saw it." She told me in her second letter she feared someone from London had recognized her. "Or come looking." "King's Cross," Wimsey said, "which leads not to condiments and larks, but to trains, transitions, and the sort of subterranean comings and goings that rarely condescend to daylight." He turned back to her. "You didn't come here seeking proof of murder. You came seeking proof she was still alive and smuggled out, or hidden, or preparing once again to run." Her lips parted. The instinctive denial collapsed before reaching sound. "You thought," he continued gently, "that if she had been forced into silence, she might yet be waiting for someone to notice the door had closed behind her." The girl's voice, when it came, was raw. "I know people think she died, but I don't believe it. Not until I see her. Not until I know." Wimsey bowed his head a fraction, as if acknowledging a vow. "Then we must find out which corpse has been buried," he said softly, "and whether it belongs to anyone at all." Wimsey did not dismiss her at once. He merely drew a contemplative breath, as though adjusting to the new shape of the puzzle laid before him. Outside, the wind scraped along the glass panes with a long, low hiss, like something trying its luck at entry. "You have not asked me the obvious question," he said at length. The girl frowned faintly. "What question?" "Why I have not expressed the least surprise." She hesitated. "Should you be?" "Not in the least," he replied. "A woman vanishing inconveniently, only to reappear under an alias beside a man who just happens to profit by her silence, falls well within the range of English domestic tradition. We have made a national art of smothering unpleasant truths beneath correct stationery." A strained, astonished breath escaped her, half laughter, half despair. Wimsey continued more quietly. "Tell me, did she ever speak of returning to London, of facing this husband openly, rather than outrunning him?" The girl shook her head. "No. She only said she meant to finish something, put something right that had gone wrong. I don't know what she meant, only that she sounded resolved." "Very nearly a prelude to disaster," Wimsey murmured. People are never so vulnerable as when they believe themselves finally in control. He moved past her, opening the orangery door to the corridor beyond. The house lay hushed, lamplit in patches, with that peculiar stillness that comes not from peace but from listening walls. "You must return to whatever plausible errand brought you to this neighborhood," he said. "If anyone saw you near the hall, you must be merely curious, never connected. A secret shared prematurely as ammunition handed to the opposition." She looked stricken. You mean you believe me?" "I believe," said Wimsey lightly, "that lies tremble on a different key than fear, and you, my dear child, are terrified in perfect tune." He escorted her to the service passage rather than the front stair, pausing where a narrow side exit opened toward the orchard. The path would return her to the lane without crossing the more traveled parts of the grounds. Just before she slipped through the door, she turned back. "If she is dead," she whispered. "If someone here—" "Then they have not merely buried a body," Wimsey said softly, "but a witness. And witnesses, living or dead, have an inconvenient habit of being found." She stared at him a moment longer, as if testing whether hope could still attach itself to anything at all, then nodded and disappeared into the dark. Wimsey waited until the faint sound of her footfalls faded, then drew the unopened letter from his pocket. King's Cross. Thin paper. No crest. A hand too careful to be casual. He turned it over once. Lord Peter remained perfectly still for a moment, weighing the implications of what he had just heard. The remark about the rector's absence had not been casual. Miss Hartwell had delivered it with the brittle calm of someone who has rehearsed a line too many times, as though waiting for precisely this question to arise. He observed her hands, resting rigidly on the arm of her chair, fingers bloodless where they pressed the fabric. She was not afraid of scandal. She was afraid of discovery. "Curious fellow, the rector," Wimsey said lightly, as though discussing the weather. "Off to the continent, is he?" She hesitated. Hesitation is a telltale luxury, usually denied to liars, unless they are confident of being believed. "Yes," she said at last, "a matter of health. The doctors insisted." "Continental air has always been wonderfully restorative to a guilty conscience," said Peter inwardly, though aloud he gave a mild, sympathetic murmur. Bunter, who had been silently cataloguing the room in that unassuming way peculiar to well-trained valets and seasoned reconnaissance scouts, shifted his attention toward the escritoire, where a sheaf of parish correspondence lay conspicuously out of order, as though rifled in haste. One envelope protruded half-torn from beneath the blotter, the seal cracked but not opened fully. Wimsey saw it too and filed away the detail like a coin dropped into a slot. No noise now, but certain to clink eventually. "Odd thing," he continued conversationally, "that a man so recently engaged in parish matters should not have seen fit to mention his departure to the bishop. I gather even the vicarage maid expressed surprise." Miss Hartwell's eyes flashed, alarm, then anger at having betrayed the alarm. "The bishop does not follow village schedules," she said sharply. "There's no reason he should have been informed." Peter smiled thinly. Unless, of course, the rector had reason not to appear to be fleeing at all. There was a faint sound then, a kind of suppressed breath, not quite a gasp. For one sliver of a second, her composure cracked and something bleak and terrified peered through. And there it was. Not proof, not yet, but the shadow of proof, cast long before the object itself comes into view. A knock came at the door, discreet but urgent. The maid, pale and rather tremulous, announced that someone had called at the rectory, begging to see whoever was handling matters, and was in a desperate state. She could not say more, only that the caller seemed half mad with agitation. "Show them to the drawing-room," Wimsey said before Miss Hartwell could object. "We shall attend directly." The girl fled, evidently relieved. Peter rose slowly and dusted his cuffs, the picture of bland civility. "If the rector is abroad," he said softly. "It appears someone in your little circle has not yet received the memo." The silence that followed was glacial. He turned, and Bunter followed him out, closing the door softly behind them. It was not flight now, but pursuit, and whoever waited in that drawing room was either the thread that would unravel the whole tapestry or the final knot tying two secrets together. Either way, the pace of events had changed. Wimsey felt it like the click of a lock sliding back. Not a condolence, not a social formality, a message sent after the wife was already supposed to be ill. He slipped it back into his coat and resumed his path through the dim hall with a new, sharpened stillness to his step. If the dead woman was not Lady Chevenham, and the widow was never a widow at all, then someone in this house was not mourning, only tidying up. The scandal, once untangled into daylight, proved in the end to be of that dreary and unmistakably human variety which prefers fear to confession. The rector, undone by debts and a moral cowardice rather than malice, had conspired with Miss Hartwell to falsify parish accounts under the pious pretext of short-term borrowing, a euphemism for misappropriation swiftly turning to fraud. When their little arrangement grew too large to conceal and the threatened discovery seemed imminent, panic furnished what neither honesty nor courage could produce: an escape. His abrupt disappearance, assisted by Miss Hartwell's quiet obstruction, was not loyalty so much as desperation shared. The young man who had arrived wild-eyed at the rectory that evening had been the unwitting hinge upon which the whole scheme turned. A former parish clerk turned whistleblower by the unpleasant experience of realizing that he himself was being prepared as the convenient scapegoat. What he lacked in eloquence, he supplied in terror, and terror is often more articulate than confession. The bishop, once informed, moved with grave and dispassionate efficiency. Funds were restored, most of them at least, reputation less so. Miss Hartwell did not stand trial. She resigned her post and the church, withdrawing to a quiet coastal town where, no doubt, she might cultivate the humble virtues she had so eloquently praised in others. The rector was persuaded back to England under circumstances discreet enough to hold the newspapers at bay, but decisive enough to remove him permanently from clerical authority. No grand villain, no Gothic mastermind, merely the small moral erosion that begins in self-excuse and ends in ruin. Wimsey, for his part, accepted no thanks beyond a rather fine lunch, and a note from the bishop containing both gratitude and thinly veiled relief. There is something, after all, profoundly tedious about crimes born of timidity. They lack the elegance of intellect and the operatic drama of wickedness. Still, tidiness is its own reward, and Lord Peter always did enjoy a clean finish to a ragged mystery. On their return journey, Bunter observed, with that mild tone which suggests judgment politely sheathed, that the matter might have been avoided altogether had certain persons possessed a somewhat sturdier conscience. "My dear fellow," said Peter, glancing out at the passing landscape with a faint, rueful smile, "most sins begin as administrative oversights. Only the grand ones bother with ambition." He settled back in his seat, cane resting against his knee, and allowed himself a small sigh of satisfaction. Behind them, St. Anselm's would heal in time. Cathedrals have survived worse than hesitant villains and nervous conspirators. Ahead lay London, and with it dinner, music, and perhaps a more interesting puzzle tomorrow. For the moment, however, the case was closed, tidily, quietly, and with the faint sense, as always, that human frailty was the most persistent mystery of all.